This is Poppy Gerrard-Abbott, researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm reaching you from COVID-19 lockdown in Edinburgh, Scotland. You're listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series, which focuses on producing less represented sociological and feminist approaches to the COVID-19 pandemic. This podcast is also interested in supporting the voices that should be heard at this time, but are often not. So today, our special episode features two supermarket workers who have agreed to share their realities with you and their political and personal interpretations of the outbreak. Today, we'll be offloading about what is going on in our supermarkets as they fuel the nation through the pandemic, and discussing narratives around unskilled labour, the politicisation of their roles, and taking seriously the emotional worlds and impacts of working in frontline key roles during this pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to launch straight into the questions to get us started on this fascinating conversation. Please settle down and listen to their important messages, as we are extremely lucky to have them here with us today. So starting off, COVID-19 has highlighted many inequalities in our global and local societies. Do you think staying at home is an economic and class privilege?
So I'm a little bit in two minds about this question. I certainly think there are roles and jobs which, if you're able to stay at home, they are typically the more, let's say, middle class, office worky sort of things, and working in a supermarket, and of course other jobs such as healthcare, other carers. They tend to be lower paid ones for the most part, and we have to go into work at the moment. But at the same time, there are lots of people who are also in lower paying jobs, self-employed people who do trades and stuff like that, who aren't able to work at the moment and are staying at home as a result. So I don't know, I'm in slightly two minds about that.
Well, it's kind of difficult to say, but I have always thought that the people who earn more are usually the ones that are doing less work. So I've noticed within my own store that people who are higher up aren't coming in because they don't have to. But then everybody that's on the shop floors, so at night and during the day, managers and such, we're constantly coming in earlier and earlier, doing more and more. And when it comes to class privilege, I'd have to say it's a difficult stepping stone because it does depend on the work that you're doing. But yes, it is quite difficult to say. But I would say that people that are at a lower end of the spectrum economically seem to be the ones that have to be coming in or are suffering the most from it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think class privilege can be experienced in quite complicated ways. So there are people that are losing their jobs at the moment, and then there are people that are keeping their jobs but having to operate in very different environments. So it is a complicated question. And within one company, there can still be lots of different experiences of class depending on seniority. So those who can stay at home will, and they tend to be higher up in management. Absolutely. Thank you. Do you have anything more to add on that question before we move on?
Obviously, if you work in an actual supermarket, for the most part, people working there are sort of on the shop floor, whether that's replenishing shelves, whether that's on checkouts, whatever. I think those people who work in like the head offices or HR obviously have more scope to work from home. My experience in my own supermarket is that the sort of managers are all still coming in and working. They're all still very much coming in because they're sort of trained to also do like the shelf replenishment and stuff like that. So but yeah, I think sometimes there is just more scope for higher ups to be able to work from home if they like.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your answers there. So my next question aims to bring your experiences of working during the pandemic back to the personal and the emotional and the everyday. So I'd like to ask, what are the emotional impacts of being expected to go to work during the pandemic?
Well, I'd have to say at first I was quite proud of myself of being counted as an essential worker, but it's quickly faded away because I'm tired constantly. I'm not getting enough sleep. I mean, the nice weather's been lovely, but when you think of the fact that I have to sleep during the day, all this sun isn't quite as great for me. But my partner's had to been staying at home, and while we've been able to make it work quite well, I can't imagine for everybody it's quite the same, where you're constantly around the same people that even if you don't have even if you think that you have a great relationship, it could be quite difficult. I'm just lucky that I haven't been put into that. But going into work every day, even at night where it's completely quiet, is kind of eerie, but I don't feel the same benefit that probably somebody in the NHS is getting, which I'm not expecting it to, because what they're doing is amazing, but I don't feel as proud as I was when it first started.
And I'm interested in how that's shaped by these wartime like narratives around essential workers, and whether, as you say, that's something that sticks onto the realities of everyday working and is enough energy to see you through the difficulties of working in the supermarkets at the moment.
Well, I would just one point, but I would say that working at night has the one benefit of I don't get to see customers coming in. So I don't know what it's like during the day, but when my store was still open, it was shocking to me that even from 6 to 7, when we were open, the amount of people that were aggressive or negative was just shocking. But bear in mind, this was about 2 weeks ago, where people fighting over toilet paper, people who were shouting, getting annoyed that we didn't have pasta. And it was a bit, this is when I felt proud of being an essential worker, but it quickly faded because it wasn't respected in the same way.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to say about the emotional impacts of your work? And maybe you could speak to, I understand that you work slightly more diverse shifts, so maybe you could speak to the kind of daytime element as well.
Yeah, of course. I was thinking my experience has pretty much been the opposite of that. I suppose that probably reflects the difference in the hours that we work. I work during the daytime. The latest that I finish is about 9 at night. So I have a lot more customer interaction, as well as working on the service counters. So that's like meat and fish at the moment because the deli has been closed. I also do checkouts from time to time. I do some stock replenishment during the day, and also look after the trolleys outside. Unfortunately, where I work, we don't have a nice machine to push them for us, so we kind of have to drag them. And part of the job at the moment is to, disinfect and clean the handles of the trolleys and baskets that come in. I will say, Liam's spot on about the experience a couple of weeks ago where people were really aggressive. I can't speak for every supermarket, but there was sort of a feeling that some people almost didn't believe that we'd actually run out of stock, and that for some reason we were hoarding a whole bunch out the back for whatever reason, because we enjoyed being shouted at or whatever. So it was unpleasant. The feeling of being an essential worker has, I will say that has actually been a thing where before I don't hate my job, but I'm not in love with it. But there is a feeling with this whole pandemic that, I'm part of something a bit bigger. And I think with the lockdown, with the government's sort of rhetoric finally becoming more stern, that more and more people are respecting the fact that, yeah, this is something to take seriously, and that, yeah, we're putting ourselves at risk by having to come into work and do all this. And over the past week or two, customers have definitely been more polite. I mean, they've been far more polite than they were previously, not in the sense that I don't, occasionally get rude customers, but that's always going to happen, unfortunately. But, just people thanking me for doing what seems to be quite menial things, that would never happen before. But now I think people, for the most part, realize the seriousness of the situation and appreciate the work that people are doing. I do feel people are showing a bit more respect and appreciation for what I'm doing, but still, at the end of the day, I am a customer service person, and I think people see it as that, but someone who's putting themselves at risk at the same time.
What do you worry about, if anything? Do you worry about supply chains or your job security? Do you worry about contracting the virus?
I think job security wise, I've always felt like my job was secure because I've been told before that I do a good job and I don't have to worry about risking losing my job. This was even before the pandemic. But I'd say probably my worry is from some of our trucks not exactly getting to their destination quick enough, and then just my job gets harder because it's not coming in. But I'm not too worried about catching the virus except through cross-contamination, but I heard that they quarantine all the trucks and clean them thoroughly, so it's not so much of a concern, except when I'm going outside doing my own shopping or going about my day. But job security-wise, I do worry for a bunch of new hires that we've had, because they're all people that have been hired from jobs that they've lost, and their jobs aren't as secure, but they're still getting a small income. But I wasn't concerned until I found out from one of my managers the other day that they were hired in case any of us get sick. Because if any of us get sick, like proper workers that have been there for years, they need people to just cover us. And so that's why so many of these workers are coming through. So I'm slightly worried as to why we've hired so many, because are they expecting a lot of us to get sick? So that's the only thing I'm a little bit worried about, but it's not at the same level as I'm assuming others are, especially like day staff. I think there is a concern of contracting it.
Have you been given personal protective equipment out of interest?
I don't know what it's called, but we got the hand sanitizer. Like we got stations, but I think they're just there throughout the day because they're in like the workers areas anyway. But we haven't gotten a lot of protection for it. It's just wash your hands. So I go wash my hands before I eat and before I come to work anyway. So not much has changed.
Similarly, I'm not particularly worried about my job. I was slightly concerned when I heard that the counters were going to close in order to move people to different roles in the store. However, that sort of strategy has changed and the meat and fish counter is still staying open. And also, I'm multi-skilled around the store, so there's sort of always going to be something that I can do. So I'm not worried too much on that front. When it comes to supply chains, again, that's not something that I'm personally worried about for my store. Waitrose is a sort of small supermarket as it is, so we don't really have too much trouble getting what we'd normally get in. Things have certainly calmed down a lot when we brought in restrictions on certain amount of items people can buy at one time, or number of customers in the store and just people in general calming down, there was always going to be enough stuff to like supply supermarkets. It was just a case of the supply chains not being used to such a thing happening, and they just needed to adapt and get the stuff in, and that's happened. I'm not going to say the shelves are packed full as they were previously, but it's certainly, looking closer to normality on that front. When it comes to actually contracting the disease, yeah, that is something that I worry about, because I work during the day when the store is a lot more full. I interact with customers physically, handing them stuff, taking stuff from them, and stacking shelves, putting stuff that's been picked up, just generally stuff like that. We do have PPE. We've got some PPE. We've got gloves. We've got hand sanitizer, and in my store, that's about it so far, which isn't fantastic. And I know some stores and some supermarket chains have like protective screens for cashier workers. We don't have those yet. They're coming in, so we're told, but unfortunately we seem to be lagging behind a little bit on a couple of things. And gloves are all well and good, but it's sort of, they're only good if you remember to not then touch your face, and not touching your face is much more difficult than it sounds, as I'm sure you both have realized by this point.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing whether either of you are concerned about the supply chains, because there's been kind of so much hysteria around whether we should prepare to see food shortages, and whether supermarket workers had any insight into that being a possibility. So what I've taken from what you've said is that, yes, there has been an impact on the supply chain because of increased demand. So the shelves aren't as packed, but we shouldn't worry about there being a complete disruption and end of supply chains. I hope I've interpreted that correctly anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying.
Okay, so moving on from the emotional, if you like, to the political, I'd like to ask you the question, what are the real life impacts of being thought of as an unskilled worker by the government? So referring to, in particular, Priti Patel's recent comments and policies and approaches around international workers and migrant workers, and the jobs that should be classified as unskilled. What do you think of this narrative and this policy narrative?
I think the government seeing workers like us as sort of unskilled is it's backed up by a prevailing social attitude that says that a job that you can get that you don't necessarily need to have like a university education or some sort of like apprenticeship or trade. In fact, even a lot of trade jobs are seen as unskilled, even though they're anything but unskilled. So yeah, I think it just matches a sort of social attitude that these jobs are unskilled, and I think a lot of the time that was sort of matched by customers' attitudes, especially at like the beginning of this pandemic. Well, in the UK at least, a couple of weeks ago, with customers being rude, being quite aggressive, sort of, oh, you don't know what you're doing, or making sort of like insinuations that were lying about things or whatever. And the feeling is that, we're unskilled workers, and therefore they have the right almost to speak to us in such a manner, and that if we can't really complain because this is our lot in life and we're just the peons, if you like, and they're our bosses at the end of the day. The old, oh, I pay your wages nonsense that a lot of people like to throw out.
Yes, I think it's really important to keep hold of that wider picture concerning the cultural and symbolic value of work, which creates hierarchies of importance when it comes to different kinds of work, that then, as you say, legitimizes stereotypical opinions or negative reactions, and that can often spill over to abuse. Absolutely.
Well, when Priti Patel said that basically our work line was unskilled, I was a little bit insulted by it, and I'm still a little bit insulted by it, but probably a lot of people are. But just to take a different response, like, she was pointing it out as for immigrants, people coming into the UK being unskilled, and that's what she was saying. But what I thought was quite funny is that a lot of the people that I work with at night in the store are actually British. And when I was talking to them about this, they were saying, oh yeah, it's really insulting to be called unskilled, because they've been in these jobs for 20 plus years, and it used to be well paid. This used to be a job that'd be quite good to start in and even to continue with. But when I started, it's not a job that pays your wages. And I just think it's ironic that we were called unskilled a couple of months ago, and then it's essential work, but the pay that you get afterwards doesn't add up to what you're doing. So I come from Norway, and their difference to it is quite staggering, where the workers in that country that do this job are paid quite a lot because it is essential. Plus, on top of that, they're getting a hazard pay for what they're getting. We've recently got like a 10% to our wages for people that can still work in my store, but it doesn't really add up to more than like £70 a month. It's not worth the amount. I just think it's funny that we're counted as unskilled, despite the fact that we all need to work and we're constantly working. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, that wasn't seen as, like, customers didn't see it in that way. They were annoyed, like Anthony said, they were annoyed that, oh, we might be hiding stock in the back. And while in some cases that was true because we were holding it back for at-risk customers, this was like with toilet roll and stuff, it was a bit like just a massive sigh at the end of the day.
I don't think many people are going to see an increase in their wages due to this. And I think that once this is all blown over, anyone who sort of brings up the idea of that, I think there will be more sympathy and agreement towards NHS workers having an increase in wages. And I fully back them, and I hope they do. But I think when it comes to shop workers, it will just sort of be almost laughed at, like, the crisis is over, you're back to your easy, low-skilled job, what do you need more money for? And I think the whole low-skilled, unskilled label is often used as justification for, low pay. It's seen by society as acceptable that we are paid a small amount, because if we complain, then they can just bring someone in who, is willing to do it for the money that's being offered. You always have these sort of protests, like, let's use McDonald's as an example. It's like, pay us the living wage or whatever. And those protests, for the most part, get laughed away usually. Like, people show pictures of the sort of touchscreen menus or whatever. It's like, oh, that's what happens when you demand more money. So it's like, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I suspect that there isn't going to be much real change, if any.
So the public have been clapping the NHS, bus drivers, and to some extent people in roles such as supermarket workers. Does this support match up to what you have received in the workplace during the pandemic?
I mean, this might be because of night shift work, but don't think I've felt the same. People that I know, so people within my own building that I live in, that know that I do, that know that I'm a supermarket worker, they have been quite supportive. But in the grand scheme of things, like across the country, if you look into it, I don't see a lot of it. I see a lot for the NHS, which I think is well deserved, and I think they should get more. But I think for anybody else, like, I haven't seen much for bus drivers even. I have seen stuff for supermarket workers, so that's quite new to me. But I don't think the support's quite the same, because I personally, I think it's because we offer food rather than medical support. It's not seen as essential as medical in a pandemic because it's all around medicine. But 2 weeks ago, everybody was buying food like there was no tomorrow. But I don't know, I haven't felt the same support. Not that I'm really asking for it. And I was quite surprised when we've been mentioned once or twice, but the support from the company that I work for hasn't quite been the same. It hasn't matched up. It hasn't been as supportive as I would have thought. But this might just be because it's night work. Night work has always been a bit different, especially in my store, where we haven't been put highly enough. Like, we've always been kind of dropped down. Like, we don't have any notice boards. We don't have any like personal stuff around Christmas, for example. It's all during the day, so none of us can attend. But I guess that's just like a personal in-store thing rather than like UK-wide.
Yeah, I'd very much agree that the vast majority of the appreciation shown by people has been towards NHS workers, and rightfully so, even more than shop workers. Even those who work in the day, they are putting themselves at great risk to try and look after people during this terrible crisis. I think, as I said earlier, there have been more and more people who have been thanking me for coming into work, doing things which are seemingly menial, and just being more pleasant in general. So I suppose that does reflect that. But in terms of sort of the wider, do I feel like the whole thing was clap for the NHS, right? It wasn't clap for the NHS and shop workers and whatever. Maybe a few, specific examples of communities doing that, but the nationwide campaigns have all been centered around the NHS. And I think, like Liam said, I don't want to sound as if I'm saying, oh, where's my clap at 8 p.m? Whatever. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm just saying that there's been some small change in attitude from individuals, but I don't know if that's necessarily reflected on a wider level.
Thank you both so much for your answers there. I'm so interested in how public attitudes before, during, and after the pandemic can and should be compared, which is why I think sociologists have a role to be analysing what's going on and making connections between public attitudes and different forms of work during crisis. So thank you both so much for your answers there. Moving on to our final question. So if you had a magic wand, what would you change about the government's COVID-19 response? And I'd also like you to think about, but we could maybe treat this as a quick fire round to kind of end the podcast. What have you been impressed by and disappointed by in terms of your employers' responses?
For me personally, I'm also comparing it to the government's response in Norway, because that's where my parents are currently living. So I quite closely look at that. And I would say one of the things that the UK should have done in comparison to Norway, because their first infection was around the same time, was the response. They should have been quicker. They should have been quicker to lock down. I mean, the UK was trying to block, I think, herd immunity, or like stop that aspect of it, where I think Norway was a bit more to just lock everything down, stop it in its tracks, which from what I've seen on the numbers, it has been quite positive. But this can also be a social thing, like the society acts very different to the UK. But looking more on just like the UK's response and the company that I work for, from what I've seen, especially in my town that I'm living in, is that my store's been the first to do most things, or at least my company's been the first to do most things. And then all the other stores around the area have been following it. So I've been quite proud, if anything, of my store's like quick reactions to things. The only difficulty that we're having is the 2 meter distance, especially with what's it called, internet workers, so like .com. When people order things online, the people that go around and pick up stock, they don't keep 2 meters to us, despite the fact that we know that they work throughout the day. So when it comes to cross-contamination with them, that's probably a little bit of a worry for me. And there is a joke that we just shout at people 2 meters in like a jokingly way, but when it comes to them, it's more serious. Like I try and keep my distance because they are active throughout the day while I'm not. My interaction with customers is very minimal, but theirs is a bit more. So I'd prefer my store to have a bit more action on that, but that just comes down to managers, and we have said before. Furthermore, I'd say in the first week, it was us night workers that were saying, like, close the store. We were asking for hazard pay. And within a couple of days, that actually happened. And we were quite surprised. And that was from our manager's response, because they could see they were dealing with it the same way. They didn't like people coming in. They didn't like the fact that they had to work while thousands and thousands of people coming through. We were complaining that we had at one point in time 250 customers at 3 a.m, when the government had put out only 100 people per building or something like that, 50 people per building. And we were complaining that even for a large building that we had too many people in at one time, so we needed to close. And thankfully, we actually ended up closing. So I think while the UK could have been quicker, its current response is more or less positive. It just wasn't fast enough. And that's why we've suffered quite a little bit from it.
Yeah, basically, that I think that the government's response was too slow. I think, as well as that, the messaging about social distancing wasn't consistent enough. People seem to be being told different things by different, government officials or whatever. Also, the advertising wasn't strong enough in terms of giving the information across. For the longest time, all we had was the Prime Minister's press conferences at, I can't remember what time of day they happened, but that was people's only source of information. And a lot of people just didn't have the time to, sit down in front of a TV and watch that. The advertising's got a lot better. I mean, even on cash points, you have adverts telling people about social distancing rules. But I think it was all just too slow. I think the measures have been good that they've put in, but again, they just weren't quick enough. And in terms of testing, I think that's still bad. Targets just aren't being met. The excuse always seems to be it's difficult to get hold of tests during a pandemic. Sure, I agree, it is, but other countries seem to be managing it, providing NHS workers with PPE. Again, we're still being far too slow on that, as well as the testing for the NHS workers. Ventilators, I don't know why they decided to give Dyson a contract and Dyson just be like, oh, let's design a new one from scratch. No, don't do that. Just build ones that we know work. If you want to design another one alongside building ones that we know work, then can go for it. I don't know whether the one that Dyson has designed has been approved yet. It might well have been. I'm not going to say for a fact either way. But the point is that they still had to wait for that approval time, which I think is ludicrous. And also, I will say about the government's reaction, it seems almost taboo to criticize it, as if you criticize that, you're criticizing the entire country's response. Like, we clap for the NHS workers, but then if you say on social media, okay, clapping is all well and good, but where's the government providing the equipment they need? You instantly get shot down by people going, oh, they're trying their best, and etc., etc. I think it's ridiculous. About my own company's response to the situation, it has, in my opinion, matched the government's in that it has been too slow. We seem to be the last supermarket company, to do everything. We took far too long to introduce restrictions on numbers of items people can buy, and when we did, the number was too big, I think, in terms of the amount per item. There was not that great communication in terms of what items we were saying that people can and can't bulk buy. Like I said earlier, the only sort of PPE that we have is the gloves and the hand sanitizer. None of us have masks. I don't know if we're even allowed to wear them if we brought in our own one. I've not actually asked, but we don't have the protective screens at the checkouts like many other supermarkets do. We took ages to introduce a sort of 2-meter policy and restrict the amount of people who can come in and into the store at any one time. So yeah, I've not been massively impressed, I have to be honest.
I think that matches most people's observations about what's going on in supermarkets. When I most recently visited, and this is obviously a few weeks into the pandemic response, supermarket workers still don't have gloves or masks or basic equipment. And I don't really see conversations happening about it either. So thank you. Lots of really important points there. I think we're going to have to finish up there. But is there anything kind of really final that you would like to say that you don't feel has been covered? Or if no, is there anything that you would like to say to your employer or the government if you could?
No, I don't have anything else to add except for thanking you for inviting me onto this and for an insightful conversation.
If I was to say anything, I'd say after this pandemic's over, I think the government does really need to look at itself and see and basically say people who've been put in as essential workers for this amount of time, there should be some shift into showing that, especially when it comes to payment or resources or anything, because as of currently, I think after this pandemic ends, I think the NHS should get more funding, transport should have more funding, and a personal thing for me, it should be nationalised, all of it, buses, everything. That's a personal thing. But supermarket workers should be looked at in a different light, especially not be counted as unskilled, but be counted as essentially skilled, because put anybody into our line of work who's not experienced in it and they're not going to do a great job. Like, it takes time to have the skills to work in a supermarket and have the mental capacity to, well, not mental capacity, but just be able to do it every single day. I mean, working at night's not great, and when people have asked about it, like, oh, how do you feel? Well, you get used to it, but it's not for everyone. And I think the government needs to put that into perspective. For all of these jobs that are being counted as essential, it's not for everyone, and it should be pointed out that they should get support in some kind of way.
Well, thank you for ending the podcast on a commie note.
It's me.
Nationalise everything. There's no other note that I would want to finish it on. So thank you both so much for giving up some of your precious time to sharing your experiences and observations and reflections with our listeners. And to our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. You've been listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series by Poppy Gerrard-Abbott. See you next time.